Welcome back. A tale of inheritance, silence and rot, drawn from the margins of forgotten archives. Tonight we descend into a history best left sealed, but the records persist, and so must the telling. Before we continue, like, subscribe and share. The object was no larger than a thumb, its hinges stiff with corrosion. At first glance it appeared nothing more than a piece of tarnished jewelry, the kind unearthed from shallow earth by accident. Yet when the crust of soil was brushed away, a locket revealed itself engraved in flowing script with the initials E.L. The inscription, though faint, was unmistakably wrought in the mid-19th century hand. Helena Armenta, a historian of forgotten women's archives, had not expected to find such a relic within a burial shaft at the edge of Mount Auburn Cemetery, Boston. The excavation had begun as a simple survey, a cooperation between the university's history faculty and a team of forensic archaeologists. Yet what emerged from the clay was no ordinary interment. Beneath the coffin lid, fragments of bone told a different story. The skull bore fractures inconsistent with accident or decay. The forensic report would later confirm the marks of blunt force trauma. Dating techniques narrowed the window. Death occurred between 1861 and 1863, years when the Civil War raged elsewhere. Yet Boston's elite still preserved their rituals of refinement. It was also the precise span in which Eliza Lucero de Avila, a governess attached to the household of the Vidal family, vanished without record. Dr. Armenta, with her careful reserve, might have let the discovery rest within the academic sphere. Yet whispers stirred. A researcher in the archives of the Boston Athenaeum had already noted her inquiries into a series of private letters, sealed until recently. A trace of scandal clung to those pages. Eliza had been named in connection with Samuel Ortega, a merchant of Portuguese descent, and it was said she had planned to escape with him overseas. What followed was silence, the kind manufactured by wealth and influence. Armenta resolved that the silence could not continue. She arranged for a press gathering at the Athenaeum itself, that grand chamber where polished wood and marble busts seemed to stare down upon the living. The announcement drew not only reporters but descendants of the city's prominent families, anxious perhaps to measure how much of their inheritance was about to be dragged into light. When Helena stepped before the assembly, her voice trembled at first, not from doubt but from the gravity of names too long buried. What began, she said, as a routine examination of archival inventories, has uncovered what may be the darkest chapter of the Lucero-Vidal dynasty. The air in the hall shifted. She placed upon the lectern the evidence in sequence, a faded ambrotype photograph in which the faint outline of Eliza appeared beside a child of the Vidal household, a series of depositions written in Spanish and translated at the time, where servants whispered of her sudden removal from the estate, the fragmented diary of Isabel Torres, a lady's maid, whose hesitant script spoke of locked doors and muffled cries, and at last the skeletal remains themselves retrieved from Mount Auburn, bearing the wound of violence. Each artifact was offered not as conjecture, but as cumulative weight. The conclusion is inescapable, Helena declared, her voice steady now. Eliza Lucero de Avila did not vanish of her own accord. She was seized at the order of the Vidal household, after her intention to depart for Lisbon with Samuel Ortega became known. Confined within the family's residence on Beacon Hill, she met a violent death. Her interment in an unmarked grave was not accident, but deliberate erasure. Gasps stirred through the room, though some lips pressed tight, as though what she spoke was less revelation than confirmation of an unspoken inheritance. The historian paused, allowing silence to carry its own accusation. In the weeks that followed, the Athenaeum's archives were placed under heightened request as scholars, descendants, and opportunists clamored alike for access. Helena's team received anonymous letters, some urging them to cease, others thanking them for courage. The Vidal name still carried weight in Boston circles, though much reduced from its 19th century eminence. What mattered now was not prestige, but the weight of buried truth. Helena recorded in her notebook a final thought, penned in a hand sharper than her usual. The earth does not lie. Families may conceal, ledgers may redact, but the bones remember, and they accused. The Vidal townhouse still stands, though its shutters now face inward, as if refusing the eye of the street. Its brick facade, softened by ivy and soot, conceals the truth that its walls once heard. In 1862, when the name still commanded respect in Boston, the house was described in property ledgers as a residence of 7 chambers, adorned with mahogany fixtures, a rear garden, and ample quarters for domestic staff. Yet the notations written in a clerk's neat script do not mention what became of the governess entrusted to the children within. From the recovered diary of Isabel Torres, maid of all work, we glimpse a reality less polished. Her entries, preserved in faded ink upon brittle paper, speak in hesitant phrases, as though she feared even the act of writing. 14 March 1862, mistress no longer receives the governess at table. Orders are relayed through the nurse, and the door of the nursery remains fastened at night. I am told not to inquire, yet the child has begun to weep for Miss Eliza. 20 March, a parcel of books removed from her chamber, Spanish volumes, bound in green cloth. I was told they were improper. I carried them to the attic, yet heard her voice through the wood, low and fevered, as if she spoke to herself. These passages were long disregarded, the ramblings of a servant beneath her station. But when set beside the skeletal remains unearthed at Mount Auburn, they sharpen into dreadful clarity. The architecture of the house itself bore signs of its peculiar governance. During a survey conducted by city historians in the 1920s, an interior memorandum noted that the upper corridors were retrofitted with bolts, not for protection from without, but restraint from within. The report filed under the city registrar mentions no names, but the year 1862 is etched at the margin in graphite. Among Helena Armenta's findings was a folded inventory of household instruments. This she uncovered not in an archive, but within the basement of the Athenaeum, misfiled among medical society papers. The document bears the heading, Property of Dr. Arturo Vidal, Fellow of the Massachusetts Medical Society. Beneath in precise hand are listed, 1 obstetric forceps, ivory-handled, 2 calipers for measurement of cranial circumference, 1 phial of chloroform sealed, 1 set of surgical clamps, iron slightly rusted. Each item corresponds to instruments now displayed in glass cases, the relics of early obstetric practice. Yet here, linked to a private residence, their presence deepens the unease. Were they tools of medicine, or of control? Helena presented this evidence cautiously. She understood too well how easily such discoveries might be dismissed as speculation, and yet the pieces, aligned. The governess, Eliza Lucero, vanishes in spring of 8. A maid records her confinement. The patriarch, Dr. Arturo Vidal, possesses instruments suited not to children's play but to medical procedure. 1 letter, discovered in the folios of the New England Journal of Medicine, Volume 9, redacted in 1871, makes the matter plainer still. Addressed only to a trusted colleague, it reads, The patient resists confinement. Her mind is not to be trusted, for it inclines toward foreign affections that imperil the household. Though she petitions daily, I have determined her separation is for the preservation of our name. The calipers have confirmed her constitution unsound. Slight asymmetries, though not perceptible to the untrained eye. These are matters of heredity, and must be treated with severity, lest they be multiplied in future generations. The handwriting matches Arturo Vidal's signature. Unknown medical publications. What he terms the patient was Eliza. By the close of 1862, whispers of unease had already drifted through Beacon Hill. Parish records at St. Stephen's Church note abruptly, Miss Lucero no longer in employ. No bans published. Mention not to be made in public register. It is the silence that condemns them. Imagine the house in those months. Shutters closed though spring sunlight touched the gardens. A governess locked from her pupils, her possessions stripped and hidden in the attic, her voice rising through wood and plaster in muffled despair. Servants told not to look, not to listen, not to write, yet one of them, Isabel, dared to scratch her testimony in faint ink, which by accident or providence survived. It is a pattern seen in many households of the period, a veneer of refinement concealing rot, a physician patriarch wielding knowledge as a weapon, the household complicit through silence. Yet here, the cost was not only one life, but a buried chain of secrecy, stretching generations. Dr. Armenta in her lecture notes wrote a marginal remark beside the transcript of Isabel's diary. They feared her leaving not because she was weak, but because she was strong, strong enough to escape, strong enough to tell, and for that the family chose imprisonment and worse. When Helena Armenta spoke of her most disturbing find, She did not raise her voice. She let the silence of the hall bear the weight of it. It was not the bones that chilled her most, nor even the forced silence of the parish registers, but a set of pages bound in oil-stained leather, a medical ledger kept by Dr. Arturo Vidal himself. The book, discovered misfiled among maritime cargo logs, bore upon its spine no title, only a faded numeral 12. Within, the script is steady, neat, clinical, but the contents once read bleed beyond mere ink. The opening entry reads, 4 April 18, initial resistance moderate, confinement, successful, vital signs recorded, slight asymmetry observed in cranial vault, frontal breadth measures less than proportional, calipers employed, suspected hereditary weakness, watch for reproduction. It is the language of a physician, yes, but of one who has chosen to erase the humanity of his patient. To Dr. Vidal, Eliza Lucero ceased to be governess, ceased to be woman. She was subject, specimen, hereditary case study. The ledger proceeds with grim regularity. 11. Subject denies disquiet, though weeping occurs nightly. Pulse erratic. Administered ether to quiet hysterics. Measurements taken anew. 27 April. Resistance grows. Required the aid of clamps to secure during examination. No visible lacerations, though bruising inevitable. No visitors permitted. The margin contains a faint smudge, perhaps from blood or ink. Helena cross-referenced these measurements against the instruments listed in the household inventory. The calipers for cranial circumference. The ivory-handled forceps. The phials of ether, all described in the ledger's hand. It is a document not of healing but of violation. She noted in her research, the Vidal patriarch employed the authority of science as both shield and weapon. Within the parlors of Boston, he was lauded as progressive, a man of letters, but behind shuttered windows he measured and drugged a young woman entrusted to his care, under the guise of hereditary vigilance. It was not the first time such practices were cloaked in the rhetoric of science. Throughout the mid-19th century, societies debated the notion of degeneration, the idea that weakness of mind or body might be passed forward like a curse. Physicians, in Boston and London alike, filled journals with tables of skull shapes, with diagrams of jawlines, with theories that one malformed brow condemned a family to decline. In Dr. Vidal's ledger, the obsession with heredity is unmissable. Nearly every entry concludes with the same phrase, watch for reproduction, but the ledger is not mere notation. Interspersed among the measurements are fragments of reflection, almost confessions, written in smaller, tighter script, as though meant to be hidden. Cannot permit her departure. She knows too much of the children. Already they bear resemblance. She should not name. She looks upon me with hatred. Were it not for science I might falter, but the name Vidal cannot be sullied by her tongue. Dreamed again last night of the fracture in her skull, the seam that marks her difference. I must know if heredity speaks in bone, yet how to open without killing. Here the script breaks off into a jagged line, ink trailing down the page. By 1863, the governess, Eliza, had disappeared entirely from household records. The maid Isabel's diary ceases with an abrupt entry in June. She is gone. The mistress says she has returned to Spain, but I heard no carriage, no trunk, only silence, and the doctor's heavy tread in the passage at dawn. After that, Isabel never writes of Eliza again, but the ledger continues, and here the horror shifts from confinement to experiment. 17 July 1863, subject no longer resists, breathing shallow, pulse faint, measurements complete, disposal must be considered. There is no entry after that date. The bones unearthed at Mount Auburn decades later bore marks consistent with the notes in the ledger, faint abrasions upon the skull where calipers had pressed, evidence of chemical sedation upon enamel and hair. These findings, examined by forensic scholars in the 1970s, were long suppressed under private order, lest the reputation of the family collapse. But it was too late. Helena, piecing together diary, ledger and exhumation, brought forth what the Vidals had buried. One cannot overstate the cruelty disguised in scientific phrasing. What Dr. Vidal called measurement was mutilation. What he called ether for hysteria was forced sedation. What he named hereditary inquiry was an obsession with control, silencing the one voice that threatened him. The governess was not merely inconvenient, she was dangerous to him, for she held knowledge that his household, his lineage,
depended upon concealing. Helena concluded her second lecture with words that struck like a hammer. She was erased in life, and nearly erased in death, but the instruments could not keep silence. Their steel remembered. Their marks upon bone outlived him. In that moment, the hall was quiet as listeners felt the chill of centuries, the recognition that in the name of science, in the shelter of family honor, a woman had been broken, catalogued and erased, and yet, through records that should never have survived, she speaks again. Among the surviving papers, Helena Armenta unearthed. None felt as alive as the fragments from the servant's wing, though most were unsigned, preserved only as scraps within bundles of household receipts. Their tone betrayed fear, collusion, and the corrosive weight of silence. One note in hurried Spanish script read, "We are not to go near the east corridor. The mistress says it is for the doctor's studies, but I hear steps at night and moaning. Isabel says it is the young governess. I do not believe she has gone to Spain. She is still there." Another, in English, bore a trembling hand. "The doctor forbade us to light the lamps on the third floor, yet last Tuesday I glimpsed shadows moving against the drapes. When I spoke of it, the steward struck me and told me to hold my tongue." These fragments speak to a household rotting from within. Obedience and terror coexisted. Orders were obeyed not from loyalty, but from dread of reprisal. Helena emphasized that while the Vidals commanded prestige in Boston society, patrons of learning, benefactors of the Athenaeum, their servants lived under a climate of fear. To speak of what lay behind the bolted door of the East Corridor was to invite dismissal, ruin, or worse. In one rare testimony, recorded years later by an aged laundress named Margaret O'Shea, the truth peered through. "I never saw her with my eyes, but I heard her often enough, low crying, muffled, like someone pressed a pillow to her face. Then sometimes the clink of metal, the scrape of chair legs. We all knew someone was kept there, but it was not our place to name it. If we named it, it became ours, and that we could not afford. Fear became its own discipline. The household operated by implication, by room. No one needed to be told twice."
It was not only sound, but smell. One maid reported a bitter odor that seeped through the corridor, ether mingled with lamp oil. She tried once to burn herbs beneath her apron to mask it, lest the other guests notice, but the scent returned, clinging to her clothes. Another servant recalled the doctor's tools laid out upon linen cloths, not hidden, not locked away, but left visible as a warning. Forceps, calipers, syringes, each one gleaming, each one a silent command to stay silent. Even the children of the household, young cousins visiting for lessons, whispered of the woman upstairs who never comes down. When they spoke too loudly, the governess of another wing silenced them with sharp fingers. The children learned quickly to treat the East Corridor as if it did not exist. By the late months of 1862, unease thickened into rumor that seeped beyond the servants' wing. Parishioners noted the absence of Eliza Lucero at Sunday Mass. A priest in Cambridge scrawled a puzzled note. "The governess has not confessed these 3 months. I am told she is abroad. Yet no passage record appears in the ship manifests." The contradiction was plain, and yet no one pressed further. The Vidal name was shield enough. Respectable society accepted the explanation at face value. It is in this very acceptance, Helena argued, that the true horror deepened. To vanish under a roof of ill repute is scandal. To vanish under a roof of prestige is silence. Still, the silence cracked in private. In one surviving diary of a junior physician, Dr. Jonas Park, there appears a cryptic entry dated November 1862, visited Vidal household for consultation, shown subject briefly, sedated, pallid, breathing shallow, patient did not speak. I inquired of her diagnosis. He named it hysteria compounded by melancholia. I found signs inconsistent, muscle bruising, irregular pulse. I was urged to sign my observations and depart. Declined. Will not return. This is the only independent record of Eliza during her confinement. It was suppressed, folded into personal notes discovered only in 1924, among Park's papers. The fact that it survived at all is remarkable. Helena underlined this point. Where one physician recoiled, others did not. Vidal's peers closed ranks. They spoke of him at symposiums with admiration. They cited his papers in journals. None asked what had become of the governess, whose body bore the cost of his inquiry. By early 1863, whispers no longer stayed confined to the household. Vendors who delivered to the Vidal estate reported hearing muffled cries when the wind was right. A coachman returning late with supplies swore he saw a pale hand withdraw from behind a shutter before the lamp within was snuffed out. These stories bled into tavern talk embroidered by rumor. Some said a mad woman was chained in the attic. Others swore it was not madness at all but punishment for betrayal. Yet no one dared speak the governess's name aloud. Names are powerful. To give her name was to risk her shadow following. It is here, in the convergence of ledger, servants' fragments and outsider testimony, that the pattern becomes undeniable. Eliza was not absent. She was present, too present. Her suffering shaped the rhythms of the house. Her confinement dictated its silence. Her erasure bound it together. And yet the more her existence was denied in public, the more she haunted the private corridors. The governess who could not be named became the governess all remembered. Helena's words closed part 4 of her address with a stark reflection. They thought to bury her in silence, but silence has texture. It hums. It presses on the skin. It is never neutral. In that house, silence itself became her voice. The hall trembled with that final phrase. For those gathered, the sense grew that what was being revealed was not merely the cruelty of one man, nor one family, but the capacity of society itself to collaborate with cruelty, so long as the name above the door commanded deference. Among the most disturbing artifacts Helena Armenta displayed was a folio of anatomical sketches, each stamped with a seal, property of the Massachusetts Society of Practical Medicine. On first glance the drawings appear typical of the era. Skeletal renderings, musculature, pelvic diagrams, yet closer inspection reveals a single figure, repeating again and again, the body of a young woman, unmistakably modeled upon Eliza Lucera. Her likeness was anonymized, reduced to lines and measurements. Beneath each figure ran notations in Vidal's hand. Subject A, pelvis contraction at 7.3 cm, inheritance probable, recommend observation of progeny if conceived. Another bore the chilling label, Subject A, cranial sutures unfused, hysterical predisposition, maternal line suspect. It was not medicine as care, it was medicine as prophecy. Vidal sought to read her body like scripture, to inscribe upon it a theory of hereditary doom. Helena explained that in the 1860s, medicine teetered between empirical observation and speculative pseudoscience. Terms like degeneration, tainted blood, and hysterical inheritance haunted journals. Doctors feared not only illness, but its imagined transmission through generations. The Vidals, steeped in both scientific ambition and old Iberian superstition, became obsessed with this idea that moral weakness, madness and bodily deformity passed like a curse through bloodline. Thus Eliza was not treated as a patient, but as a specimen of heredity, her body charted, her ancestry interrogated, her future children pre-condemned. Fragments of correspondence confirm this obsession. In a letter to his colleague Dr. Farnsworth, Vidal wrote, "The governess's constitution offers fertile ground for inquiry. Her maternal line hails from Andalusia, known for its melancholy temperament. I observe not mere hysteria, but a congenital proneness. The uterus itself appears marked with this legacy. If she were to conceive, her offspring would bear it indelibly." Farnsworth's reply, preserved in the Harvard archives, is no less chilling. "Your observations align with my own suspicions, that there exists a transmissible malaise, half of blood, half of soul. We must gather sufficient proofs before the society convenes in May. I advise restraint, lest the public misconstrue the work as cruelty rather than science." Here cruelty and science blurred until distinction itself dissolved. Meanwhile the household bore the cost of this doctrine. Servants whispered that Vidal summoned Eliza at all hours, demanding she submit to examinations with forceps, calipers and crude stethoscopes. One maid recalled the faint rhythmic tapping of the doctor's hammer on bone, followed by weeping muffled behind locked door. The governess's health declined. She grew pale, unsteady, her hair thinning. Yet rather than treat these as consequences of captivity, Vidal recorded them as symptoms of hereditary degeneration. One surviving sheet lists her condition in cold inventory: skin pallor marked, pulse irregular, weak, 64 BPM, hair loss, probable nervous disorder, uterine constriction confirmed. At the bottom a single line: subject's progeny unfit for reproduction. Observed termination. No one knew what he meant by termination, whether of pregnancy or of possibility itself. The ambiguity is more dreadful than certainty. Helena connected these revelations to a broader climate across Europe and America. Physicians began to cloak ancient fears of bloodlines beneath the new language of science. Terms like atavism and hereditary decay appeared in treated. Vidal's private work was thus part of a larger current, the medicalization of stigma, the scientific dressing of superstition. Yet his case was distinct, Helena argued, because he had at hand not abstractions but a living body. Eliza became the vessel through which theory was tested, inscribed and proved. The journals show an even darker twist. In 1864, Vidal began to compare Eliza's features not only with her own lineage, but with that of his wife Clara. He wrote, "The governess and my wife share traits of constitution, though of differing vigor. It is my contention that both stem from tainted lines, though in Clara it lies dormant, refined by northern admixture. Eliza, however, exhibits the fault naked and unmitigated. In one page, wife and governess are collapsed into parallel specimens, both reduced to diagrams of pelvis and womb. It was obsession disguised as inquiry, jealousy disguised as science. Here lies the essence of the horror. Vidal did not merely torment Eliza, he constructed an entire intellectual edifice upon her suffering, a theory to be cited, circulated, admired, even as her cries seeped through the corridors. Her likeness traveled in journals, stripped of name, recast as subject. This dual erasure, silencing her in life, abstracting her in print, ensured her pain became both invisible and indelible. Helena concluded Part 5 with the chilling observation that medical horror often outlasts its subjects. Where a body may be buried, a theory survives. Where a voice may be stifled, a diagram endures. And so Eliza's confinement became not only a private torment, but a legacy in print, echoing long after she ceased to breathe freely. The audience sat motionless, each listener aware that what began as whispers in a corridor had grown into a doctrine, given authority by ink and seal, no less binding than chains of iron. Helena, our mentor, leaned forward, her voice subdued, as though fearful the very walls might overhear. What begins as speculation, she said, soon hardens into doctrine, and once doctrine is set, consequences follow like iron weights. The archives she displayed bore wit. Folded into Vidal's notebooks were not only diagrams but registers, family charts that bore resemblance to parish genealogies, though twisted into instruments of pathology. Each name of the Lucero line was annotated with a symbol, a cross for death by melancholy, a circle for infertility, a dagger for madness. Against Eliza's name, Vidal inked a cruel mark, tainted wound, and beside it a note: her progeny, should it come, will bear the degeneration. The atmosphere of the Vidal household turned oppressive. Servants began resigning under mysterious pretexts. A gardener confessed decades later that he had fled after seeing the governess stagger from the physician's chamber, her gown stained, her hands trembling as though she had been made to grip heated iron. Clara Vidal, the doctor's wife, retreated into silence. In her remaining letters, fragments of unease leak through. The walls echo too much. I hear her pacing at night. Sometimes it is her steps, sometimes his. I cannot tell which is worse. At times Clara's tone swerved to resignation, as if she believed herself bound in the same inheritance her husband sought to prove. If what he says of the blood is true, then I too am marked. Perhaps I am only spared because I was chosen by him. Such words reveal a household devoured by his doctrine, where fear was no longer confined to the specimen, but seeped into every relation. In 1865, Vidal presented a paper to the Massachusetts Society of Practical Medicine. Though never formally published, its transcript remains in private archives. Its title, Observations on Hereditary Nervous Maladies in the Female Constitution. Within it he describes Eliza, thinly veiled, as a subject of mixed Spanish descent, aged 23, of melancholic bearing, prone to nervous agitation, with congenital pelvic disproportion. He concludes with a chilling pronouncement: the evidence compels the view that nervous disorders are not incidental but congenital, that they pass from mother to daughter, as surely as the color of the eye. In such families, reproduction must be weighed against degeneration. What applause greeted this address, the record does not say, but the fact that the transcript was preserved with respectful annotation suggests that his peers did not reject his cruelty outright. Instead, they folded it into the slow tide of medical speculation,
letting his obsession feed the broader current of hereditary doctrine. Back in the household, Eliza's body bore the consequence. Testimonies from servants suggests that her monthly cycles were forcibly tracked, her pulse measured at dawn, her diet restricted to broths and tinctures. Vidal recorded each change not as signs of illness induced by confinement, but as further proof of inborn One entry: skin eruption, hereditary weakness manifest, insomnia, neural taint of maternal line, refusal to speak, hysteria confirmed. Even silence, Helena observed, was turned into evidence. The less Eliza resisted, the more he claimed victory over her body as a text of heredity. Yet the cruelty did not remain contained. Clara Vidal's health began to falter. Letters suggest she suffered palpitations, sudden faintness, and periods of speechlessness. Where once her husband adored her, now he compared her symptoms to Eliza's. Writing, Clara shows subtle parallels, palpitations akin to subject A, though in milder form. I am persuaded the two stem from a shared defect of constitution, though my wife, through refinement, conceals it better. Thus his theory began to cannibalize his own household. What began as the torment of a governess spread into suspicion of his wife, then into the very notion of family itself. If all were tainted, then all were subjects. Helena displayed a final object, a long narrow case, lined with velvet. Within rested surgical instruments, forceps, calipers, a pelvic measuring device, each etched with Vidal's initials. Some bore stains darkened by time. Here, Helena whispered, is how theory became practice. When you measure the womb as though it were property, when you chart the pulse as though it were a signature, you are not merely recording, you are reshaping life into specimen. These tools are not neutral, they are the very grammar of cruelty. The audience shuddered. Some could not look upon the instruments, for they bore the double horror of intimacy and violation. By 1866, Clara's correspondence ceases altogether. No further letters survive in her hand. In the parish register, a single note appears beside her name: buried, fever, age. Whether fever alone carried her, or whether her husband's obsession hastened her decline, no record confesses, but in Vidal's journal, written days after her burial, appears a single chilling line. One line extinguished. The experiment remained. The experiment, Helena explained, could mean only Eliza. With Clara gone, the governess remained the lone focus of his hereditary pursuit. Part 6 closes upon this dreadful narrowing. A household once of many, now reduced to one subject, one body, one torment. Theory no longer hovered in journals or lecture halls. It had collapsed upon the governess, like a stone, crushing possibility, family and hope beneath the weight of inheritance. The audience sat silent, aware that what was once domestic unease had hardened into fatal consequence, that the cost of doctrine was counted not in proofs but in graves. Helena Armenta's voice lowered until the words seemed almost confessional. There comes a moment, she said, when obsession ceases to be theory and becomes destiny. For Eliza Lucero, that moment arrived under the hand of the very man who claimed to study her. The documents of 1867 hold a silence as dreadful as any confession. Parish ledgers, Vidal's journals, fragments of servant testimony, all converge upon a single season, when the governess vanished from public sight.
In early spring her name still appears in the household accounts, cloth purchased for gowns, medicines administered. By midsummer her name disappears, not dismissed, not married, not buried, simply erased. In its place, marginal notes in Vidal's hand: subject stage advanced, womb examination required. Evidence of hereditary taint confirmed through palpation. The language is clinical, yet behind it lies the unspoken truth. Eliza had conceived. Helena unfurled a fragile page from the Vidal journal. Its script was tight, feverish, almost illegible. At last, confirmation that degeneration transmits. The womb carries proof not only of her constitution but of the line entire. Her offspring shall embody the flaw, and in its body the evidence shall be fixed beyond dispute. No mention of marriage, no recognition of humanity, only the reduction of conception to experiment. The implication chilled the room. The governess had not simply been studied, she had been made into the vessel of proof. In the servants' depositions preserved decades later, hints of her suffering survive. One maid remembered carrying trays of broth to the attic, where Eliza was confined. Another spoke of hearing muffled cries through the floorboards at night. A third claimed to have seen blood upon the stair. hastily washed yet never entirely effaced. One testimony, though written years after, remains unforgettable. She looked pale as wax, her eyes like glass. She touched my arm and whispered, "It isn't mine. It never was mine. He says it belongs to the record." Helena's eyes swept the hall. Understand the cruelty, pregnancy, a matter of life and love, here becomes evidence. A child, not awaited with joy but with calculation, its body before it drew breath, was conscripted into the service of theory. In the journal's next entry, Vidal described preparations. His instruments were sharpened, ether secured, forceps laid in order upon a cloth marked with ink diagrams. If delivery comes prematurely, so be it. The specimen must be observed at every stage. Failure would imperil the doctrine entire. The phrase specimen hung like smoke. Helena allowed the silence to stretch, forcing her listeners to confront its weight. And then blackness. The record collapses. The following parish register contains only one note: unbaptized infant, interred quietly, mother unmentioned. In Vidal's own journal, a line of red ink has been drawn across several pages, as though censoring the contents. Below, in smaller hand, the matter concluded, the lesson secured. The line tainted beyond recall. No description of Eliza's survival or death. No trace of her in later documents. She vanishes into the margins, absorbed into silence. The implications were unbearable. Did she die in childbirth? Her body broken beneath instruments wielded as weapons? Was she hidden away, living ghost-like in some sanatorium, erased from the record by design? The archives will not say. What remains is absence itself, the most terrible form of evidence. Helena laid down the journal with care. The hereditary doctrine consumed its own witness. Eliza was reduced to nothing but a cipher. Her body the site of proof. Her name extinguished. For a moment even the electric lamps seemed to dim, as though the room itself recoiled. And yet Vidal's star did not fade. In 1868, he traveled to Boston, delivering a lecture on degenerative transmission in nervous females. His peers applauded. Reports in the medical record hailed him as a pioneer, though none mentioned the cost in human life that had purchased his authority. Thus the private horror of the Lucero household was laundered into the language of science, its anguish transformed into doctrine. What was stolen from one woman's flesh became truth for an age. Helena's closing words for this part carried the chill of inevitability. Once a theory is written in blood, it resists erasure. The child, if indeed it lived, if only for moments, was never named. The mother's voice was extinguished, and yet the doctrine thrived, replicated in lecture halls, in journals, in the quiet prejudice of physicians for decades after. One life was silenced, but the consequences multiplied like shadows across generations. The audience remained still, as though any sound might profane the memory. The story had crossed a threshold. What began as uneasy speculation had hardened into irreversible outcome, loss, silence, and doctrine carved into bone. Helena Arenta straightened her notes as though steadying her breath. The room hushed to stillness seemed to lean toward her. By now, she said, you see how absence itself becomes testimony, but absence leaves traces, erasures, substitutions, papers too clean. The cover of silence is never seamless, and in 1871 the seams began to a bundle of correspondence discovered decades later in the provincial archive of Corrientes preserves the first glimpse of disquiet. These were letters between parish officials and the provincial health office, formal, terse, but edged with unease. It has been brought to my attention that certain notations regarding the Lucero servant Eliza do not appear in baptismal registers. The omission seems deliberate. Likewise, burial accounts record expenditure for an unnamed infant, with neither mother nor father listed. This practice is irregular, and reflects poorly upon the integrity of the parish. The words are bureaucratic, but beneath them lies an unspoken accusation. Someone had manipulated the parish books, and all signs pointed to Dr. Arturo. Helena drew out one letter in particular, its ink still black, its edges brittle. We cannot in good conscience overlook the tampering of registers. Vidal insists on medical confidentiality, yet the records bear gaps so grave that rumor festered. It is whispered the governess perished in his care, and that her remains lie hidden in ground not hallowed. This, Helena explained, was where silence began to fracture. Rumors spread among the servants and townsfolk. Some claimed Eliza had been buried in the orchard under moonlight. others that she lingered in a convent infirmary under false name. The contradictions multiplied, and with them suspicion. Vidal, however, did not retreat. Instead, he published, in 1872, his treatise on the degeneration of female lines appeared in Buenos Aires. Within, couched in the language of physiology, lies unmistakable reference to the Lucero household. One subject of lower domestic station exhibited transmissible flaws confirmed through ish. The offspring survived but moments, yet sufficed to prove the hereditary taint of the line. He had transformed Eliza's suffering into argument, her silence into evidence. He spoke of specimen and issue, never of woman or child. The treatise was lauded in medical circles, copied, debated, absorbed into teaching, but Helena reminded her listeners, science feeds upon silence, yet every silence holds a remainder. The tampered registers, the vanished name, the contradictions in testimony, they became the loose threads from which the cover would unravel. In the private ledger of the Lucero estate, one entry stands out: payment to undertaker for removal of remains. Instructions discreet, witnesses no name, only remains, the sum unusually large. This ledger, Helena explained, was never intended for public eyes, yet its survival condemns. Who was carried away in secrecy? The unnamed infant, the governess herself. Both. The absence resists clarity, but the payment testifies louder than any sermon. And there were voices, quiet but persistent. A former maid, interviewed in her old age by a parish curate, recalled being ordered to scrub a floor stained dark. Another remembered a box, heavy and sealed, carted away under tarpaulin at dawn. Most haunting is a margin note found in an 1873 volume of Annales de la Medicina. Rumor holds Vidal purchased his proof with more than ink. Some debts can never be discharged. The hand is anonymous, the words nearly erased, but not entirely. Helena paused to let the weight settle. Thus the story entered its second life. Not merely the event itself, but the whispered recognition that something had been covered. A woman extinguished, a child unmarked, records cleansed yet imperfectly. This is how secrets fester in contradictions, in margins, in rumors too persistent to die. And so the confrontation sharpened, though never openly. Parish officials pressed for clarity. Vidal dismissed them as ecclesiastical meddlers. Families in Corrientes began to avoid his services, yet in Buenos Aires he still thrived, feted as an innovator. Here lies the paradox. In the city he was applauded, while in the province whispers corroded his reputation. His name carried honor in journals, but unease in corridors. The duality of Vidal, lauded in public, distrusted in private, would define his final years. Helena turned a page of her notes. In these contradictions lies the cover. One world celebrated his science, another remembered his cruelty, and between them, the truth of Eliza Lucero was ground to dust. She let her gaze linger on her audience, then added, but the dust remained. It clung to registers, to ledgers, to whispers in kitchens and churchyards. And decades later, when investigators reopened the boxes, the dust bore witness. The cover could not hold forever. The hall was silent, save the scratching of pens. The story had shifted, from secrecy within walls to exposure in the archives, from silence to fissures in silence. What was hidden in 1867 pressed upward in 1871, and though suppressed, the confrontation had begun. Helena closed her folio for the night's lecture with a warning. Every cover leaves seams, and when the seams split, what spills forth is never wholly controllable. Vidal believed he had secured silence. Instead, he had planted rumor, a seed that outlives the hand that sowed it. Helena Armenta resumed her lecture with no preamble, as though the silence between sessions had been but a pause for breath. The cover, once strained, cannot endure what begins, as rumor grows teeth, and in Corrientes by the mid-1870s, those teeth had begun to close around Dr. Arturo Vidal. The first true breach came from within the parish. In 1875, Father Ignacio Pereira composed a memorandum to the bishop. His language was subdued, but each line carried accusation. The records entrusted to me do not correspond to truth. Children buried without mothers, mothers vanished without burial. I fear the physician has employed us as his accomplices by omission. In conscience, I can no longer be silent. This memorandum, preserved by accident in diocesan papers, was never answered in ink, yet its existence testifies. The church knew, and chose silence. Still, Pereira's words did not vanish. They were copied, whispered, recited in kitchens and corridors. Helena paused to describe how rumors hardened into conviction.
The servant spoke of voices heard in the locked attic, of a child's cry stifled by cloth. Neighbors noted that Eliza Lucero's name could not be found in the cemetery, though they swore they had seen a shrouded form borne past at night. More damning still, a midwife named Rosa Cardenas, long silent out of fear, gave testimony in 1876 to a traveling physician. She described being summoned in haste to the Vidal household years before. There she saw an infant, malformed and gasping, while Eliza lay pale and near death. "Do nothing," Vidal commanded her. "Nature has spoken." She obeyed, paralyzed by his authority. The child expired. Eliza, fevered and delirious, begged for water. By morning, both were gone, one to silence, one to erasure. Rosa never spoke publicly, but her words were taken down in a notebook, later found among the papers of that itinerant physician. In careful hand he recorded, "I believe she told truth, though terror haunts her still." The reckoning sharpened further with the collapse of Vidal's household. His wife, Celestina, left a fragmentary diary, pages water-stained, ink blurred but legible. In an entry from 1877 she wrote, "I can no longer endure the odor of antiseptic that clings to him, nor the silence that fills these rooms. They say my husband heals, but I know he dissembles. Something cries out at night, though no child is here. I pray for relief." Months later, Celestina was gone, returned to her family, her absence noted but never explained. The physician, once respected, now lived in solitude. And then, the archives yielded their most damning fragment. A letter, unsent, written in Vidal's own hand, found folded into the cover of his treatise. Its tone was defensive, fevered, almost confessional. "They accuse me of cruelty, yet I only sought knowledge. What is one servant against the progress of generations?" The defect was clear, the line unfit. Better that it end in silence than multiply in weakness. "They will not understand. They will say murder. They will call me monster. Yet science requires sacrifice." Helena's voice trembled as she read those words aloud to her audience. "Do you hear? He names it himself. Sacrifice. But whose consent was asked? None. The choice was his alone, cloaked in the authority of medicine." By 1878, his practice had dwindled. Families sought other physicians. The journals in Buenos Aires still cited him, but he did not return to the capital. He remained in Corrientes, shadowed by suspicion, shunned by neighbors. Some say he took to drink, others that he continued experiments in secrecy. The truth dissolves into rumor, but the end is certain. In 1879, he was found lifeless in his study, surrounded by bottles, his desk stacked with papers meticulously ordered, but incomplete. On the desk lay one final notebook, its cover stamped property of the Provincial Society of Medicine. Inside, diagrams of skulls, measured with calipers, pelvises, drawn in ink, annotations in his cramped hand. On the last page, a line without continuation. The defect recurs. No method yet arrests it. Perhaps in future. The sentence breaks off, as if death interrupted his pen. Helena closed her notes and looked out at the silent hall. So ends the physician, alone, unredeemed, his words unfinished. But the story did not die with him. It lived in the whispers, in the tampered registers, in the testimonies copied and hid. The reckoning was not a courtroom or gallows. It was remembrance. He could not bury every trace. He could not scrub every stain. She let silence hang for a long moment, then whispered, "And yet do not think this is resolution. For the cover may collapse, but what lies beneath is not buried. The documents remain, the diagrams persist, and the questions he raised, the temptation to sacrifice one life for the study of many, those questions echo still." Helena, our mentor, set aside the final folio with visible care, as though its edges might burn if touched too hastily. She spoke in a quieter register now, each word falling like a stone into a still pond. The conclusion of the Vidal matter is not one of triumph, nor even of proper judgment. It is, instead, collapse, a slow, unglamorous disintegration that left fragments scattered across paper and memory. Yet those fragments are enough to assemble the outline of a ruin. The aftermath unfolded with no public trial, no tribunal. There was only dispersal. The Vidal household empty. The servants found new employ. The midwife Rosa vanished from the record. Celestina returned to relatives, under a name not her own. The parish, unwilling to stain itself with scandal, quietly transferred registers. Pages were recopied in a different hand. Lines adjusted. Infants buried without mothers became orphans on paper. Women who had vanished into the physician's care were rewritten as emigrants or distant cousins. A century later, Researchers would uncover the oddities: birth records without baptisms, baptisms without burials, the sudden silences in families otherwise prolifically documented. The house itself endured longest, though emptied of neighbors said shutters rattled at night, though no one dwelt within. The windows darkened not with curtains but with dust. In the upper rooms where once instruments clinked and cloths were laid, only fragments remained: a cracked bottle of ether, a drawer lined with brown stains, a rusted pair of forceps, dulled by time. When finally the estate passed into disrepair and was razed, workmen uncovered beneath the floorboards a box of notebooks. Some were burned by mildew, others intact. On the covers appeared stamps: property of the society, do not circulate, specimen record. Within, neat columns of measurement: head circumference, length of femur, pelvic span, notations beside certain names: terminate, observe, discard. These were gathered by a municipal clerk and filed in an envelope marked miscellaneous medical paper. It was this envelope, unopened for decades, that Helena herself had requested from the provincial archive. I handled them with gloves, she told her listeners, but no glove can protect against the chill that rises from such pages. For here in cold figures and abbreviations, lies the ledger of a man who saw mothers and infants not as souls, but as specimens. The collapse of Vidal's reputation was more gradual. In his lifetime he had been cited, respected, consulted. After his death his works were less and less referenced, then not at all. By 1900, his name did not appear in any index of physicians. By 1920, even in Corrientes, it was unknown save as rumor, and yet rumor is persist. In kitchens, elders told children not to linger near the ruins, lest the doctor's shadow take them. Pregnant women whispered prayers against the hand of Vidal. It was as though his erasure in print had amplified his survival in story. Helena leaned closer to the microphone, voice dropped. This is the paradox. Silence is never perfect. What institutions erase, whispers preserve. What documents omit, marginalia restore. And in these scraps, Rosa's testimony, Pereira's memorandum, Celestina's diary, the unsent letter, there remains a story that will not be buried. She described her visit to the last remnant of the Vidal household, a single iron gate, now rusted, standing alone in a field overtaken by weeds. On its arch faint letters, still spelled Vid. Passing through, one stepped not into a house but into absence, as though the structure itself had been consumed by time, leaving only a threshold. I felt, she said, that to step through was to enter not land but memory. And in that memory, the cries, the notes, the unanswered letters, still echo. A ruin is never empty. It holds what we cannot bear to name. The lecture closed, not with resolution but with warning. These papers teach us nothing if read only as curiosity. They are warnings about authority unchecked, about science unmoored from compassion, about the silence of institutions, willing to redact, rather than confess. The temptation he embodied, the weighing of lives against knowledge, did not die with him. It waits always in the shadows of progress. Helena drew a breath, almost a whisper now. And if you doubt that, remember the box of his notes sat unremarked for nearly a century, marked merely miscellaneous. Think how many other boxes remain unopened. Her words lingered like the closing of a prayer, the kind that leaves silence more eloquent than speech. The lights dimmed, pages closed, but no one in that hall felt closure, only a chill awareness that something unfinished had brushed against them.